So we'll get started. So my name is Faith Zerby. I am the monitoring director, I suppose, along with other things, with Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I'm really happy that you're all here to learn about pipelines and shale gas drilling. And what we're going to do today is first, gratitude, right? Thanks to everybody who's been here, but also everybody who's helped with this. I'm here presenting, but there's been a core of wonderful people who've been on the ground. And first and foremost, of course, our volunteer monitors and our protectors, right? They're really our sentinels, and they're so very important to all the work that Delaware Riverkeeper Network accomplishes on the ground. They're the local people who know their watersheds, and I just can't say enough about our protectors and our monitors. Mohammed Sarar, it was a DRN intern with Delaware Riverkeeper Network. He's fabulous. He's a data guru. He's helped with a lot of the slides that you're going to see on data in this presentation. We've got, and he's still in the country, believe it or not, he's allowed to stay. It was touch and go for a while. DRN advocacy and legal colleagues. Again, I touched about this on the talk at the beginning, but that idea that we're really, really blessed in the Delaware Riverkeeper Network to have an incredible collaborative staff of legal attorneys and advocacy folks, Maya and Tracy, who can take information and kind of lead with it, which is phenomenal. Our technical experts are wonderful. Michelle Adams is here. I think some folks from Princeton Hydro are here. But again, we use volunteers to collect a lot of information, but then sometimes we're also using technical experts to ramp up that data collection and get what we need for litigation. Because a lot of what we do nowadays, I'd say in the last 5 years, has been litigation oriented. And it's because of the threats that we're facing and really the tool that we need to have to be able to try to slow some things down. Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, anybody know ALARM? I think ALARM folks are here today. Lauren, who's now with DCNR, was with ALARM many years ago, but again, really important partner. Dr. Hongbing Sun from Rider University, I'll talk about the work collaboratively that we've done with them related to road salts, because it's kind of tied in. And then, of course, the Delaware River Basin Commission. A lot of times DRN, we're giving a hard time to our agencies, right? We're pushing them and we're suing them. That's the reality of usually the stance we need to take. But what we do know is that there's people on the ground and biologists and people working on the ground with the agencies who are doing tremendous work and amazing work. It's just often the politics that be as it goes higher up, we have changes. I'll try to stay here. Let's see if this works. So we're going to talk a little bit about Volunteer Shale Watch. This program's been in development since 2010, and we're going to talk about Don't Drill the Delaware. Anybody know what next week is, March 14th? Okay, March 14th is a meeting with the Delaware River Basin Commission, and I'm going to go into it, but if you don't have anything to do besides go to work and raise your families, come on over during the day and be part of the DRBC action that we will be doing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's related to drilling. I'm going to talk about volunteers and the pipeline monitoring that we've been doing. First, I'm going to talk about, I guess you could say the Band-Aid approach, but when we've lost pipeline battles and we're going in and we're looking at erosion and sediment and other issues, we'll talk about that watchdogging. Then we'll switch gears and talk about pre-assessment and habitat mapping. Sounds like Jeffrey just signed up to do some vernal pool mapping. So again, that's preventative to help with the data gathering. And then we'll talk a little bit about Penn East. I'm just going to touch on this. And DTE midstream. Anybody here from Berks County? Okay, so Bethany's our lone Berks County person, but DTE is kind of a new power plant that's being proposed that's connecting to, I believe, a 14-mile pipeline. So I'm going to move over here because I'm going to keep looking at my slides, and I apologize in advance. So first, the Basin Commission. Who was here in 2010? Who remembers when we were going to have drilling in the Delaware River Basin? I love this when I feel like I'm ancient, because so in 2010, drilling was something that came up, right, in the Delaware River Basin. We thought, what is going on? We got the pollution call that somebody was knocking up. And we worked really hard with lots of people collectively and lots of organizations to eventually get a moratorium on drilling in the Delaware Basin. So there's no active drilling in the Delaware River watershed, right? Where we sit now and up in the headwaters, no drilling right now. That could be at stake based on some signals that we're seeing, which is why we're kind of organizing people now to make sure that they know that we're listening and we're going to meetings. So March 14th is a really important date for that, where we're organizing residents to get out and citizens to get out to the DRBC meeting in Washington Crossing to talk about why they don't want drilling, and really just to have a engaged action. I don't think there's too much public comment at that point. But back in 2010, we organized buses, people went upriver, and we said we do not want drilling, we do not want gas drilling regulations. Remember with the Delaware River Basin Commission, and I know I'm to talk about monitoring, but I can't help but talk about policy too. But the DRBC is made up of the 4 watershed states and then a federal rep. So our governors in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and our state federal representative are the 5 individuals' votes who keep drilling out of the basin. They are our targets, those governors. Anything you can do to target those governors to make sure that they know you do not want drilling in the Delaware River Basin is super. So that's just, and again, they're the commissioners on the Basin Commission, but I won't go too nuts and bolts into that, or we'll be here all day. So where are we at? We had this moratorium on drilling in the Delaware Basin. Hooray, drinking water for 17 million people. We haven't had drilling in our basin yet. It's a huge success because we are in Pennsylvania, folks, the fossil fuel extraction capital, and we have in Pennsylvania over 8,000 wells that are slick water hydraulic fracturing. And here you can see all of these green dots. This is an old slide. Goodness, what's the date? 2013, I believe. But these were all wells that were put in since that time that are hydraulic fracturing, and now we're up to 8,000 wells of drilling. And we're not going to go too far into it, but with each gas pad site is a pipeline site, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, this all sort of kind of ramped up in 2010. Pennsylvania's been drilling. And what we've learned as the physicians for safe energy and healthy energy, what we've learned is that it's not really safe. Now, a lot of us may have thought of that, right? Precautionary principle. Everybody knows about precautionary principle, right? This concept that, this might not be a good idea to be using these chemicals and to be fracking the earth. But essentially, the scientists really did a great job. We have now over 900 peer-reviewed studies showing the health problems and the negative impacts on slick water hydraulic fracturing. We did not have that in 2010. There was some, but not a whole lot. So right now, the data and the science is on our side, right? Political will, not really on our side, folks, right? But we have the data and we have the science. And really, the scientists did a tremendous job getting that data into it. And PSE Healthy Energy is a great resource if you're going to talk to your representatives about drilling that you don't want in the Delaware River Basin. Make sure you go to this site. It has all the peer-reviewed literature, and it's nicely summarized. And some of our wonderful representatives, like Leanne, who's from Delaware County, she's used it as a presentation, and she's printed out all of the stacks of research that show the harms to take it to the PA legislators, her colleagues, to say, we have a problem here, folks. Maybe drilling isn't so safe. And I'm saying this all because, again, it's related to the volunteer monitoring community. So this is a little bit of an older slide, but again, in 2010, there was a lot of talk about, environmentalists, you're crazy, you're talking about earthquakes, you're talking about the sky is falling. Well, now we have earthquakes, right? More than before because of drilling, and the storage of the water that is used, that is contaminated. And we have a lot of things coming out that make us very nervous about the DEP's ability to really regulate this industry. This is an action. If you're looking for something to do, like Terry said, write down the Attorney General's number right here on the top and give him a call on March 14th and ask him to look into and investigate what's happening with these complaints that were uncovered by our colleagues at Public Herald. Great resource. Public Herald does a lot of work out in the drilling area. So they have a lot of information. They've done a lot of file reviews on that. So just keep that in mind. It's a way to kind of trigger those upper echelon folks. So if there was going to be drilling in the Delaware River Basin, which at this point, again, there isn't, Delaware Riverkeeper Network commissioned a study. Now this was before, who knows what state has a ban on slick water hydraulic fracturing? Shout it out. New York. Yes. So this was slightly done before that came out. We were all celebrating that day when the governor said, yep, it's too dirty, too many unanswered questions, too unhealthy. We're not going to do this to our New York residents. But again, so keep that in mind with the caveat of this, but I just want to go through this a little bit so that you know what's at stake. This is a kind of map of Pennsylvania. The red are those areas of gas drilling density projected, okay? Projected in the future, right? Because what we've always said, again, precautionary principle, a lot of the monitoring data that's been sort of represented by certain agencies has been, oh, well, there's been drilling going on now for 5 years and things still are looking kind of okay, right? Dr. Jackson talked about this a little bit. There's triggers and there's signals, right? There's tipping points, and sometimes when something starts, you may not see it actually imprinting, right? That idea of planting trees, you might not see that benefit yet. But thinking logically, as most of our community does, is, hey, let's think about what would the build out be if there was going to be drilling in the Delaware River Basin, which is drinking water for 17 million people. So that's what we looked at, and that's what we asked CNA to do. And they determined that Wayne County would be a hot spot. That's that red area up in the top left, and the green again is the Delaware River watershed. So again, you've got a lot of drilling through that Marcellus shale layer. And again, we're not talking too much about the details of that. And they had two scenarios. They had a dispersed scenario where you would have had 4 wells per pad, and a concentrated where you would have 8 wells per pad. And they kind of just took those two scenarios. They also investigated what was happening in Pennsylvania, right? Because it's the same geologic layer, that deep shale formation. We're talking about 5,000 to 13,000 feet below the earth is where the shale is. So they took those two projections, and these are kind of the take-homes I just want to go through real quick. And this is just kind of showing some clusters. But these were the key points to our decision makers. And again, this is relevant because right now we're hearing signals. There is a lawsuit in play where people are suing because they want to be able to drill in the upper basin. So it's really important that these are things that you take with you if you're going to be talking to folks. So first, we could have 4,000 wells at full development in the Marcellus Shale, okay? That's quite a lot, and again, this is in the wooded area of our watershed, those clean streams that we're trying to actually upgrade. It's not in the more developed areas down south near Philly where, for example, I live and many of you might live. The total area disturbed, again, looking at this analysis, is 18 to 26 square miles. If, again, the full footprint of that shale drilling, if we were to be doing it. And again, that's as big as 570 to 840 Walmart supercenters, just to kind of put it in perspective. Again, the wooded areas, Wayne County. Who's been up in the upper Delaware Basin? Who's been up to the Delaware water cap? Okay. All right, so forested streams, wonderful streams. Looking at people and impacts to people, because we know people are getting sick from this because of the emissions. 45,000 people will live within 1 mile of a well pad. If you look at the science now, and again, a lot of our veterinarians have been doing a lot of science, and a lot of our healthcare professionals have been doing science on people getting sick, right? I know many people who've called, they have low birth rate babies, there's issues, they've had pregnancies that have terminated. Things are happening in the drilling zones. To people, and a lot of the studies, again, are Pennsylvania. We are kind of the guinea pigs to the industry at this point. Another thing they pointed out was land cover disturbance. So this could add up to 1% to 2% of forest cover lost and 5 to 10% reduction of core forest. Again, fragmentation, we'll talk about that later, but we have some nice big chunks of forest up in the upper Delaware, and as we cut roads and drill pads and such, we have a problem. And I'll just point this out because it's not, I don't have it in the slides, but this is an example of a drill pad, right? They're usually about 5 acres in size, and every drill pad has an access road that it has to go to. Sometimes they use an access road, and then every drill pad also has to have a pipeline that leaves from it, a lower pressure pipeline. So it's not just that pad site, it's all of that way to get the gas from point A to point B. And again, we have folks here, down the non-drilling areas where we have pipelines that we'll talk about. Water withdrawals, this is also really big, right? Because again, at DRN, we really care about our small streams. They're really important for cleaning the water. But on low flows, it could remove up to 70% of water from the small streams. Again, usually it takes 5 to 7 million gallons of water to frack one well. And again, that's a consumptive use for the most part because it's injected into the earth and only contaminated water comes back up. And again, I'm brushing over gas drilling. I could talk to you about that for an hour. Other thing, discharge of wastewater, right? So that water that comes back up, about 70% stays in the geology, right? We lose it. It's just down there. Maybe it shows up. Maybe it helps cause an earthquake because of the shifting and the fracking. But that remaining waste that comes back up, what do we do to it? Where do we take it? This gets at that, right? It's very highly concentrated chlorides, and we'll talk about it because this is one of the things that we use with volunteers to figure out what we're going to be our parameters. And then, of course, land cover changes could increase with erosion and sediment control. This is a pipeline, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline, and I'm going to have a lot of pictures, compliments of TGP for pipelines that they've built in our watershed. But you've got these steep slopes, and of course, when you remove trees on a steep slope and it rains, you can have sediment going into the watershed. So again, just showing a little bit of that impact. So these are all important things to consider. So again, unconventional gas drilling, this is your typical site. Has anybody ever been out in the frac areas? Like to the, I know I used to do a lot of backpacking out there, so we've got like 2 people. But it's not that it's far away, and if you go to any of our state lands, there's a lot of drilling and fracking on our state lands, unfortunately. But you don't have to drive far to get there. What I want to point out here is that you can see the access road right here to get to the pad site, and then you can see them laying the smaller, what's called a gathering line. So again, each one of these pads has to have that infrastructure to be able to move the gas to whatever market they want. And this is just the list of issues related to fracking, which I won't go through. You can read it and get a feel. Okay, lots of things going on there. So it's important for critters, right? I'm a biologist, so I always like to talk about critters. I wish I could talk about them more and not drilling. But this highly saline gas drilling waste affects how critters are able to survive, right? It essentially kills them. And these are our mayflies. Any fishermen in here? Yeah, we got our mayflies here. Really, really important. They help eat up nutrients in the system. Very, very important to clean water and clean health downstream. And these guys are super sensitive to changes in salinity in the water, which is one of the current concerns with gas drilling. And that's kind of where our shale watchdogs come in, right? So in 2010, we were panicking because suddenly we realized we had to deal with fossil fuel extraction. We've had to deal with it right in the Schuylkill headwaters with coal mining. But in the Delaware Basin, it was kind of limited to Schuylkill County and Lehigh, and a lot of that was coal mining, very different. Animal, also not so hot, but a very different animal. So we got volunteers out, and we trained them, and we worked with Alarm and others. Trout Unlimited is involved and has their own program as well, which is very similar to ours because we always like to partner. But these are the monitoring parameters that we ended up selecting. We looked at total dissolved solids, salinity and conductivity using a meter. We looked at macroinvertebrates, and we looked at chlorides and temperature. We decided to shake out sulfates. We didn't do them. Anybody know what those little critters are on that rock? Those are little caddisflies. It's a caddisfly condominium, okay? And these guys, can you guys see the slides okay? We can't turn the lights down, I guess, right? Because of filming. But they live on the rocks. And if you ever go in a stream, I mean, one of the most beautiful things you can do is just pick up a couple rocks and look at it. And you're going to see all of this incredible diversity and insects. And some people don't like insects. I think most people here probably are on board with insects because they do amazing things for us. But the more diversity in insects you see, the healthier the watershed is. So these little guys live in these little houses. They make their houses out of little stones or bits of leaves, depending on what kind they are, and they kind of paste them together, and then they are in there, and they live in there. And then as the water and their little whatever they eat goes by, a lot of them are filter feeders, they'll just put their little head out and they'll eat some algae and they'll do some fun stuff. And you'll see their heads poking out, but there's a whole world under there, a whole microscopic world, and it's just absolutely beautiful to spend some time out. It's a good way to calm your nerves if you're nervous about anything going on. So we use the Lamont tracer. This is a conductivity probe. It's about $85 through Lamont. It was tested by Alarm, but this is what our volunteers use to get that those conductivity readings mostly. It also calculates TDS. It gives a temperature and salinity, but the TDS and the salinity is programmed in. So the conductivity is the most important number, and it's pretty accurate, plus or minus 2%. Then we use the chloride kit also, and again, this is because again that brine waste is 5 times saltier than seawater is the rule of thumb for brine. That's very, very salty in freshwater streams. So we use the chloride test kit as well. And volunteers were geared with that. And they went out in 2010 and they documented along headwater streams. We knew of some areas where they were going to be drilling based on where people had signed leases. So we were trying to position people so that if drilling began, we would have some good baseline data that would be downstream and upstream of the pad sites. But as you can imagine, those of you who monitor, it can sometimes be a little bit tricky to do that. But that was kind of the goal. And we got people out, and people went out for once a month. That was considered baseline. If drilling was going to begin, which was going to be over our dead bodies, we would have upped that. But essentially, people got out about once a month to collect information on their streams that they adopted in the upper Delaware. And we did quarterly analysis too. And then we also supplemented our water chemistry with macro sampling, looking again at those caddisflies, those mayflies living in the streams, and filling gaps. We coordinated a bit with Delaware River Basin Commission for that, which was phenomenal. Again, it's always really great if you can partner with the biologists and the people working in the agencies, because they do good work and they ultimately want to do the right thing. So we worked with them to kind of fill some of those gaps. And then we did, what was really cool is Alarm had the ability and the funding at that time to do barium and strontium testing also for these sites. And those are considered signature chemicals that tend to be very, very low in our streams and rivers. You don't want to have much of those constituents in the water, but they were able to do barium and strontium testing for us. So the volunteers would send off their samples, and this was also a quality assurance, quality control, right? Because we had an external lab. Alarm would also test, and they'd say the volunteer got this conductivity level, and the Alarm scientist got this level. This volunteer passes, and they're good to go, and they know what they're doing. So it was kind of a two-pronged system. So just some results, and again, Mohammed put a lot of these graphs together, but we collected data from 2010 to 2016. There's still some volunteers that are collecting data, and we're kind of, we're at a point, we have quite a good solid amount of baseline. 1,351 stream samples were collected at 123 stream stations for conductivity and temperature. And then we also did those barium and strontium for about half of those sites, 60 samples for those areas. And we're still working on getting some of those other ones filled, but the funding kind of dried out, so we had to find some more funding. But essentially that's kind of our data set at this point, though volunteers continue to do monitoring. And then to complement that, we had 22 benthic samples that were done, macroinvertebrates. Why would you want to do macroinvertebrates versus water chemistry? Anybody want to do a shout out? Like, why would it help you to know in the back standing up?
Cheaper and easier. You can tell just by the stuff that's living there.
Okay. Yeah, it's not cheaper for us because it costs more usually, and it's a little bit hard. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to actually ID the animals also. But what's really key with it is you have insects that live there all the time. So if you're doing water chemistry and you're out there with your probe, and today was a good day, and then all the readings look good because the water's just passing by, you only get a snapshot. But if you were out one year and you looked at the insects and they were amazing, and then you come out the next season and you look again and suddenly something has changed, something might have happened, right? Because they live their full life cycle until they're an adult in the stream. So it's always nice to supplement macros with insects if you can and if you have the luxury of doing it. And Stroud Water Research Center does some really great trainings on macroinvertebrate monitoring for citizen monitors. But what I always say is you have to continue to practice because you can forget the insects pretty quickly. So this is, and again, so I'm just highlighting some of the water chemistry here, but what we found is what we expected, right? We found low conductivity for baseline. And again, remembering this is important because they're freshwater streams. You don't want to have a lot of salt water in your freshwater because it's not going to be good for the insects. But this is just showing the 24 sites that had the most data, and kind of shows that, you know, how, let's see, we got as high as maybe, you know, it's less than 200. A lot of things were in the 100, like less than 100 range, microsiemens per centimeter. So again, really good, healthy water for the most part. We also found that most of these streams were cool and healthy, right? They have good riparian buffers for the most part. They're up in those beautiful headwaters that have, you know, less stormwater runoff and more forest. So the green in there shows you the preferred temperature range for trout. Trout's really important in Pennsylvania because it's a recreational fish, but it also means that there's a lot of good insects that live there too. So you can see like our range, we've got some spikes here and there, which would be normal, but you can see in general we've got decent mean temperatures. This is showing the upper temperature limit for rainbow trout. All right. And then this is just the monthly means, showing how, looking over a 12-month period, all of our data tied with cold water fishery. Everybody know what that means? Cold water fishery and warm water fishery. These are designations. These are those hooks that we need to continually use. We need better water quality standards, but every stream has a designated use, and with that are tied parameters that you can monitor to determine if that stream is meeting its designated use or not. So cold water fishery is where all the trout live, and you can see our blue line goes, you know, correlates pretty well with that. So again, really good clean water, which is what we hoped to find. And then barium strontium, really low, which is what we hope to find. And again, these are signature, the reason we picked these were signatures for gas drilling. And you can see the upper, the yellow and the gray line, that's showing what that flow back, that waste, drilling waste would be, right? So and this is also a logarithmic scale, okay, because it's such a difference. So this scale is not exactly 1,000 to 0.01, it's logarithmic, but the point is you don't want to have this in your water, and this would be drilling waste, which is highly contaminated and toxic. So that kind of shows where we are there. And again, it's a very good baseline information, and we've shared some of this data with agencies, not all of it. And then we looked at the critters, right? Who knows what that little guy is in the bottom right? Very close. It's a stonefly. It's hard to see. He doesn't have the little fluttery gills. He's one of my favorite guys that's out there. And here is kind of just some Pennsylvania sites. We have New York sites too, but you can see excellent, very good, fair, excellent, pretty decent conditions for streams. So that was some of the information. And when I want to say the caveat here is when we do our bug collection, we have volunteers come out and help us, but usually we have a staff scientist that's involved with it for that purpose. Do you have yes?
Yeah, just quick, the Benthics, you just do that in the spring?
Yes. Yeah, it's usually early, like even now, March, like early is better. So what we do in Pennsylvania, we do it in the spring. In New York, we do it in the summer, just because we follow the protocols of what the states do, and the states do it differently. So we kind of adapt the protocol that the state uses so that we're able to compare it to their information, and also because they're often the data user. Again, that's something you always want to think about with your study design. It's a good question. But it's a great thing to do in the spring. And actually, if you do it in April, a lot of people do it at Earth Day because the animals are pretty big and people can see them better for educational purposes. So data is being used on multiple fronts right now. That's just a little bit of a summary. We're pushing for the upgrade of the upper Delaware Basin. This is really very important right now. We've been working on it since 2011. It's the squeaky wheel. We have to just keep working on it. The permanent ban on shale drilling, again, really, really important. So monitors come out and speak to the truth of these streams and the fact that they're very, very clean. Addressing localized threats, you know, when we were doing this, sometimes we found other issues, right? We found some failing septic treatment, you know, sewage, package plants weren't the problem, but sometimes people don't maintain their septic systems, right? Up in the Poconos, there's a lot of glacial soils. There's not a whole heck of a lot of area to clean up your sewage. And then pipeline complement was big too, because a lot of these folks, you know, we had gotten really geared up if drilling was to happen. We didn't have drilling, thank goodness. And then a lot of those folks also started doing pipeline monitoring because we did have pipelines. And that's a caveat to that. So in November 2011, just to give you a story, because I think we always need a pep talk, but the idea was everybody had testified for months and maybe over a year. I can't remember the whole background story, but it felt like it was a whirlwind. People went to meetings. They talked about why they wanted no drilling and why they wanted their health protected. It wasn't looking good. Gas drilling regulations came out, and they were really bad. We commented. Technical experts commented. Volunteers commented. A second draft came out. Those drilling regulations were actually worse than the first draft. Wasn't looking good, right? We were doing all of those citizen pieces, the monitoring, the technical expert reports, the litigation. Things weren't looking good. And we knew that there was going to be a meeting where they were going to approve the gas drilling regulations, because at this point we knew that those governors, we knew that there was kind of a nebulous who was going to vote for who, right? And we're trying to get at those governors talking. Delaware really did a great job. The little tiny state of Delaware was wonderful, and I still think they probably saved the day, even though you never know exactly how it pans out. But essentially, Delaware was not going to vote for those regulations. And on the day of, the day before the meeting that was going to be in Trenton, we had done the week before nonviolent direct action training, something really to think about for our toolboxes, folks. I think in the environmental movement, we need to be using this tool more and more, right? We've never had any kind of justice issues come about if we're just doing the science and just doing the data collection and just going to the meetings and being, good citizens sitting there talking, and then they're not listening to us. NVDA training became a big part of this because we realized, man, now we're up against the wall. And the day before, and as you would think, with a lot of people probably have stories about this, but the day before the meeting, we got a call. And Tracy Carluccio, anybody know Tracy Carluccio? She's like a mentor and a wonderful person. I learn from her every day. We got a call, and the police said, DRN, do you need the Porta-Johns for your big rally outside? And we were like, do we need the Porta-Johns? Like, of course we need the Porta-Johns, right? Because we got the permit to have the rally, because you can't have you can't convene people unless you have permits. So we had the big permit, we had the Porta-Johns, we had everything in place, we had everybody trained for nonviolent direct action, and the police said the meeting was canceled. And some of us were in the office thinking, what's going on? And then Maya, the Delaware Riverkeeper, got a call from the state of Delaware, and they said the meeting's been canceled. So this is how a lot of environmental things happen, right? They're not some big victory, but it was canceled and it was postponed. And that's kind of where we were. We were in a holding pattern now for the last couple years. But essentially, we still convened. We still had people speak. We still spoke truth to power in the sense of having people realize that they were really part of that movement. But now we're at a point where they're looking at it again, right? And we want to be strong again. We want them to know that, hey, in 2010 we were strong, but now we're even stronger, and we have even more science behind us. So it's really critical. March 15th, just be on the loop. If you're on our listservs, you're going to get information about it, but it's really, really key. And now we have many more people involved and engaged, I believe, to stop that. So how am I doing on time?
We are okay. We are at 30 minutes now.
30 minutes, okay, perfect. So switching gears to pipelines, yay, okay. So what we're focusing on with pipelines, and I'll wait, does anybody have a question about Shale Watch? Go ahead.
Actually, for the 5 votes, do they have to be unanimous?
No, it has to be that they have to have 3.
Okay.
Good question.
5 states.
You have 4 states and 1 federal rep. So you have 5 votes.
There was only one state that wouldn't vote.
Well, we don't really know. But the point is we did a lot of action in Delaware, and we felt, and Delaware has nothing to lose, right? Pennsylvania is a no-brainer. They want drilling because they have the Marcellus Shale. New Jersey doesn't really have drilling, but we had Christie, right? So it was, Delaware, just really had nothing to gain from allowing drilling. And the federal rep we didn't think was on too. But it's a little bit hard to know, right? We're not on the inside. We don't necessarily know. But yeah, those are our targets for this, those DRBC commissioners. They stand between us and clean water and drilling. So
The federal rep, is that person from the federal agency?
Yeah, usually Corps, Army Corps.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, usually it's a colonel. I don't know who it actually is now, but yeah, it's usually the federal rep is the Corps. And this will be a question, because now when you think about it, the Corps, a little bit different political paradigm at this point. So pipelines fueling gas drilling, again, this is your typical site. You got a wastewater impoundment there, you got a frac pad, you got the road. But the purpose and goals, again, for our volunteer monitors on this, and this is construction monitoring now we're talking about. So those of you who might be Mariner 2, even though there's still some, litigation didn't seem to work, but we've got a couple irons in the fire. Orion pipeline is another. these pipelines are going into this construction phase. So we want to get people out there to be the sentinels and to look at basically erosion and sediment issues on the ground for the most part, assist with documentation, and demand that fines are assessed, okay? And again, this is tricky and this is hard, and I could tell you a lot about the bully tactics that were used. That's the one thing I have to say about this. So you always want to stay safe when you're doing construction monitoring of pipelines, and you want to stay out of the active right-of-way. And what we're focusing on, there are different kinds of gas lines. We talked about them a little bit, but we're really focusing on those transmission lines, those big lines that are cutting across the Delaware Basin that come from the Shale region to the west of us, across the lighter area of our watershed to other markets, right? So there are over 13 major proposed pipelines. Many of these pipelines have been built. Some of them are still in the works. And of course, they're going to all these different places, right? We have now Mariner 2, and it's going to be coming to the Sunoco plant down in Marcus Hook. So, and a lot of the gas is also to be exported, right? Which is kind of often a signal or trigger mark for some folks who may not be against gas, but who don't really want it sent abroad. So we've been dealing with these large transmission lines, which are these high pressure lines that carry gas for hundreds of miles to get to other places. So a lot of the pictures that I have are those high transmission lines, not the gathering lines. But you could use the same approach if you were in drilling country too. And then along each of those high transmission lines are these compressor stations. We've done some air monitoring. Boy, I'll tell you, air is complex. We did a little bit of air monitoring on a Hancock compressor station, and we learned a lot from that process. And we don't delve in that too much, but the idea of these compressors, they often also have wetlands on the site. They're about 30 to 40 miles along the route, and they're basically to pressurize the gas so the gas keeps moving through the line. These are the big concern for air emissions, right? Even though there's also valve leaks and other leaks that happen too. So why the community needs citizen monitoring? Well, these are linear projects, right? They happen at multiple places in multiple counties at the same time. Mariner 2, how long is that? It goes all the way across the state of Pennsylvania. Do you know the stat?
It's the entire, it's
the whole state.
Horizontal, the bottom third, the line between the bottom and the middle third.
Yeah. So you have these long lines, and you can imagine there's just not enough enforcement personnel, whether by design, whether by budget, whether that we don't want our taxes to go to water, whatever it might be. There might be 2 people that are looking at the line. So these linear projects, it's really important to get citizens out there. They know their area, and they can be sentinels to take photos. And the construction process is really in depth. And again, when we do a citizen training on this, it's usually a 5-hour training to get people up to speed if they're really going to get out and monitor. So again, I'm kind of breezing through some of this, but you've got plenty of opportunities here throughout the process to look at pipelines. Again, this is just showing that linear ability with projects. Sometimes they're co-located along an existing pipeline, which makes it easier to find where the pipeline is if their construction hasn't begun. But again, they're vast, expansive right-of-ways, usually about 100 foot. And we always beg the question, can't you make it a little narrower? Just to be clear, Delaware Riverkeeper Network does not believe that any pipeline path is a good path because it leads to methane gas, which is more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. It's 85 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. So we're continuing to dig a grave when it comes to climate change if we do gas. It is not a bridge fuel. It is not something that we should be doing till we ramp up on something else. So just that is our standard on that. But again, if it's going in, there are ways that things could be minimized, and some of that we talk about in here. But again, no pipeline path is a good path. And again, when people are out, if there's construction going on, you can imagine, you can see things. This is stringing that's happening. You can see the trench up in the corner there. The pipeline company is only allowed to have certain trenches open at certain times. This is actually a wetland. Again, it's very hard to see without the lights off. But these are timbers that they have to put across a wetland path. The idea is that that's going to keep the soil from compacting, and then this is what's called stringing, right? They line the pipe up, then they'll bring the welders out. You'll see an erosion and sediment fence here. But again, this is kind of your typical construction site, and it's always important to stay off of the right-of-way, and I can go into that. But when you start reporting incidents and you start getting things in the press, the companies tend to get pretty nasty. So that's just something to keep in mind. Yes?
Do you know if there's any requirement that they remove those timbers from the wetland?
They do.
They do.
Yeah. And we can talk about when they do, because it's interesting to see the lacks, like with amphibians and things, it's a shame the time frames are not always the most sensitive. And this is just Atlantic Sunrise, which is another pipeline that's not in the Delaware Basin. It's just to the west of us, but I had this in because I talked to them last week and I did a training for them. But again, the linear nature, we're talking about a lot of wetlands that are going to be crossed, a lot of streams, 388 streams to be crossed. And the other caveat there, which is really important, and we worked very hard on this, but Fish and Wildlife Service, the drilling industry and the pipeline industry came in a couple months ago and basically said they wanted to have an incidental take of bats. And what that means is they want to get essentially a pass or a permit so that they do not have to adhere to the March 31st. And they want it to be in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and why can I not think of Ohio maybe? And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at this proposal to figure out if they do an environmental impact statement, if it's okay for them to be doing cutting any time of the year. So that's which would be a bad precedent, and we're fighting it. And there was a lot of citizen action around it. So, you know, and one more thing about endangered species, and because I just looked up this stat the other week, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about how the Endangered Species Act stops everything. You can't do anything. You can't build anything. That's actually really a lie. You know, from a perspective of being somebody who's a protector, I wish it was stronger than what it is. But you'll hear the other side often talk about that, like it's going to stop everything and we got to get rid of it, we got to gut it because you're not going to be able to do anything. That's simply a lie. That's not the case. 93% of the projects that have an endangered species, a federally listed endangered species, they go forward. So that 93%, there was an organization that looked at that a couple years ago to kind of, you know, again, alternate facts, that idea of like, it's not stopping it, unfortunately, but it slows it down, and again, you use any trigger you can get. So it's still a really important tool, you're right, but the reality is it doesn't stop everything. But we do some mapping with endangered species. And again, then there's other things, indigenous tribe impacts that happen, you know, old landfills. And again, this is where citizens come in too, because they're looking at these routes and you have old timers coming out and saying, hey, you know, back in that woods, they used to dump stuff in drums and we don't know what it was. It was the coal industry, but we don't know what it was. So these are things that come out and that come on the docket, and then they have to address it. You know, it just keeps slowing down that in EIS or EA, environmental analysis concept. So, lots of different ways, again, lots of different opportunities with pipeline construction to get involved. Sedimentation and erosion, we've got forest fragmentation and habitat loss, loss of riparian vegetation, those streams along the ribbon of green. So these are all things that really trigger in with our volunteers. And what we found with the TGP, Tennessee Gas Pipeline, which was one of the first high pressure lines that came in, it was an old line from the 50s and they expanded it. But you can see we found a 93% failure rate of actions with them. Instances of best management practices failing. The other thing that would come out is we had a really great, the County Conservation District was really very on top of things. Volunteers would call, they would get out and we'd have the photos. We would get the FOIAs to see what they would say. They would say, yes, you know, you need to be putting, you know, more silt fences up. And they'd say, yes, okay, we'll do that. But then the fences never get up, right? It's like it becomes a he said, she said. So there were a lot of violations with this pipeline, lots of failure rates. And again, that's why we need residents out there to catch it. And again, they're looking mostly, these residents and these community monitors are looking mostly at those, you know, erosion and sediment, pollution events, anything suspicious, right? And now we have, it's great, we have cameras, right? We have like geotagged cameras in our pockets that we carry around with us. Even though I will say when you're doing construction monitoring, a zoom camera is really important to be looking at what might be happening. So we're moving on. So again, and monitoring during times of rain, a great time to see if you're getting sediment discharging off of the right-of-way, which is illegal. It's illegal to the Clean Water Act, and this is really the biggest bang for the buck. Like if you only have limited time and you want to monitor a pipeline, if you don't mind getting wet, during a time of rain is the best time to get these good photos that show off right-of-way impacts of sediment getting discharged off the right-of-way, following it down into a nearby stream. It's not allowed, and it can be a violation. The other thing that some of our very dedicated monitors do is they double check with what the construction weekly reports are. And what's kind of neat about pipelines that are gas, they're regulated through FERC. FERC doesn't work, but FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have a lot of targets working on getting their reform there. But essentially, everything on the docket has to be put up on this electronic portal. So every pipeline has a docket number, and you can see when somebody submits something. It's really fabulous. So the pipeline companies, every 2 weeks, they have a construction report that they're meant to put out. And some of our monitors are amazing because they'll take this report, and then they'll go and they'll check. And they'll catch where they're actually lying in their construction report. If nobody checks, it looks good on paper, right? This is the whole concept. We don't have enough regulators, and not everybody gets out in the field. So it's really, really a helpful tool. And the other thing monitors are geared with are maps, right? We're trying to get up with apps, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's some really great Google Earth technology that we use, and we give everybody an alignment sheet, which is essentially where the pipe is supposed to go, where the temporary workspaces are. They're pretty detailed, but the idea is you kind of adopt a location where there might be steep slopes and maybe sensitive resources or habitats, and you walk it if you can. You get landowner permission, of course, too, and landowners can be great monitors, too. So that's kind of what people are geared with. And when you're in the early stages, before tree cutting, volunteers are doing a lot to look at flagging. And that's 15 minutes with questions.
Yes.
Okay. So looking at flagging, is the right-of-way marked well enough so that when those guys who work really hard with their chainsaws, who have to go in by foot because you're not allowed to have any construction equipment and cut down all the trees, are they going to see the right-of-way boundaries? These are things that monitors are very good at documenting. If signage is poor, and then once the tree cutters start, we often go to an OSHA perspective. Again, it's about slowing things down, but are they wearing their safety equipment? Are they working on steep slopes, and is it slippy and rainy? In some cases, we've shut down some tree cutting for a couple days. Anything to slow the process down, because a lot of times tree cutting begins before the pipeline has all of their permits, amazingly enough. We are allowed to do that because they assume that they will be getting their permit for wetland impacts and things like that. So slowing it down at this stage is really, really critical, even though the March 31st window might be missed. And back in the day, we thought if we missed that window, perhaps it would stop things and they'd have to wait till the next season, right? Because it would be on the onus of the company to just plan that there is going to be delays. That doesn't happen. They get a variance. They request a variance, and then they're allowed to continue to cut trees. And then when they start cutting trees, it just looks like this. And the trees often lay for a while. They can lay over water bodies and wetlands. Because they're not allowed to come in with construction equipment until they have their core permits. Then the digging and trenching phases begin, again looking at sediments and issues. Those are those timbers that somebody was asking about. They do put those down to be able to cross, because they're crossing these wetlands multiple times. So that is considered a BMP, but you don't want to have mud on those timbers getting into the wetland. Here's just some pictures again of the linear nature, so you can see how they have several construction equipment, not backhoes, I can't remember what these are called, but the construction equipment working along a steep trench, because again, they're only allowed to have a certain amount of trench open at the same time because it's a steep slope, so that's something that people document. Again, just some more pictures. This is more of the restoration stage. You can see where they planted trees. To the right, you can see those tree shelters. Again, binoculars are really important here because you will find that companies can get pretty testy, especially if you're catching them on violations. So it's good to go with a partner. And again, never give up. Don't be bullied by them. And we're there to help you if that was to happen. And again, just a couple more pictures here. And looking again at the BMPs. So compost filter socks, the silt fences that many people see, these are all things that you would be trained of, and these are all things that volunteers looked at. You're basically following the mud, and you're looking for bad construction practices. Let's see, wood mats over wetlands. You'll see, and then of course, what's wrong with this, right? It's a failing. This is the other thing that happens once it goes in, then a lot of times you have stuff laying around and they don't really keep up and maintain the the silt fence, and this is when there's still going to be areas where grass hasn't grown back, right? So it is important that these things are maintained. These are the compost filter socks. They should be overlapped a bit more, but again, all different things that we'll do. This is a steep slope that was a continual problem on this pipeline. We talked about how it was going to be a continual problem. We talked about how they should have done horizontal directional drilling so that the forest could have been saved, and they didn't. But you can see they did a lot of reinforcements here to try to stop the sediment coming off, and it just wasn't successful. The other thing to look at is they're supposed to stockpile topsoil, particularly in agricultural areas, from the subsoil. Topsoil is really important, right? We don't have that much in Pennsylvania. So they're supposed to have different piles and segregate the soils. That's something volunteers catch. And then here's just some examples of where BMPs were not working, where volunteers caught pictures of just things, getting overtopped, in other words. And if there's sediment in there, then it goes into the area that's not supposed to have sediment in it. Again, getting landowner permission. And then streams. We look at streams, and there's different ways of doing the ditching. This is the Lackawaxen River. It was crossed in 2011. The Orion pipeline is going to come and cross again this river to expand the pipeline. Once you have a pipeline in, they have their toe in, and then they keep expanding. But this was the river of the year in Pennsylvania, the year that it got cut across. But you can see the sediment plume right there.
Required to go under the Riverkeeper?
No. They were not required. We worked to try to get it to be HDD, but they said it was not feasible. It's more expensive to do a horizontal directional drill underneath. So the pipeline company is going to fight that tooth and nail, and I could tell you a couple other examples where they were supposed to do HDD, then they came in later and they got a variance. So you got to be on them. You have to be on them constantly, and try to use the legal hooks that you can. All right, so sedimentation, it's important for the critters, and we talked a little bit about that. The other thing our volunteer monitors help with are landowners who are distraught, right? Because their wells are suddenly turbid. They don't know what to do. This gentleman is in his 80s. I always worried about his heart when I would be out there, and his whole backyard was filled with the pipeline. It was also a forest that got cut down. Again, riparian vegetation is gone, so all of those trees are gone. And again, they can replant some of the pipeline, but not all of it where the pipes are located. They do not plant because they have to be maintained. And here's just a steep slope, right? So these are the trigger areas. So if you're like along the Mariner or somewhere else, and if you know where there are steep slopes or important streams or forests, those are the areas I would focus on, because there's a couple more environmental hooks that you can use to kind of try to slow them down. This is a steep slope in the sense that they have to put these berms in, right? They have these water bars, so you have stuff coming off of that. And then, volunteers also are documenting other harms, right? So it's just disturbance of wildlife. We don't know if a pipeline hit this young cub bear, but what we do know is it was during increased activity, and it was along a dirt road in the middle of Delaware state game lands. And again, we've got grades and we've got blowouts. So blowouts are key. Now, we documented soil compaction, and I won't go too deep into this, but the idea that the pipeline company says they have temporary workspaces and additional temporary workspaces. And those temporary and additional temporary workspaces are bogus, because nothing's really temporary when you start compacting the soil, right? We've learned a lot about soil and how soil focuses on. So we've tried to make them crunch those areas. And what they often do is they will put, I don't know if I put a slide in here, they will minimize the cut across a wetland, but then they'll have a scalloped out temporary workspace right next to the wetland. So it's a strange practice that they do when we're trying to get them to use the existing right-of-way, for example, instead of cutting down more trees. When you cut down a 70-year-old forest and call it a temporary, it's not. You've cut down a 70-year forest, so it's going to take a long time for things to get back, if it ever gets back. Altered groundwater. Here we've got Greg Latordo, one of my favorite people in the world, out looking at probes that were in the water. There's a little white probe in the stream. We documented thermal impacts to exceptional value streams. Again, these are the highest quality streams in Pennsylvania. This is Pinchot Brook. We've got Nikki Zenas here, who just got accepted to Yale, who was an intern, and she's fabulous. I've known her since she was 8. And she's lived up in that area, but she helped put probes out in these areas, and we documented essentially temperature regimes that were different downstream and worse downstream or within the pipeline cut. And these are all legal hooks that we can use for our litigation, and we did do some of that I won't go into. The other thing we documented in some of the state forest lands is off right-of-way impacts. So you have things like this, which we continually reported, mulching that would go up against the tree, right? Anybody who's ever planted a tree, right? You never want to put mulch next to the bark of a tree. Very bad. Landscapers will do that. They call them lollipop trees. It's terrible. You always want to have it away from the bark because it will rot the bark and insects will get in there and it will kill the tree. And we complained about this for a very long period of time. And what we found after they said that they had fixed it was that we found 70 dead mature trees off right away, right? So you have the right away where you're cutting trees, but then you have the additional harm. So again, these are all things that we use, and that's all part of our evidence with FERC and some of our litigation. And in the end, for this one, we had 60 instances where BMPs were not present. This was all kind of collected by our volunteers. And again, when I say volunteers with this one, we had about realistically 8 core people who went out. We had a lot more people who were trained, but the reality is everybody's busy. So this is like 8 people getting out there for a long period of time, and they were able to uncover these kinds of issues with the pipeline company. And we were able to get it on the docket, and there were fines that were assessed. And again, to me, these fines seem as they're a slap in the wrist because these are multi-billion-dollar corporations, which is a whole other issue that we have to work on from the regulatory side. But we were watching, and it did work. So finally, pipeline pre-assessments, and I realize we're supposed to do Q&A, maybe you guys can just come up after. This is mostly for Penn East, and again, Penn East is one of the proposed pipelines that we are concerned with, and we need volunteers to get out and essentially look at using our new Habitat Impact Mapper, which is an app that we're using, which is really helpful because Penn East, a lot of it, there's no existing right-of-way, so if you're out there and you're like, where the heck's the pipeline going to be, and there's no survey flags because you're in the early stages, this helps you get on the pipeline right-of-way to walk the pipeline right-of-way. So we're actively getting people involved on that project to basically assess the habitats, the vernal pools, the T&E species that might be out there, like the bulrush, to collect information. And if you would want to be part of that, you can be part of the all-day training, but we're also doing some modules online. And what we found with this, and again, this is ideal, right? Because our idea is we want to stop that pipeline. That is the pipeline we are going to stop. And the data has been really, really beneficial for the environmental impact statement approach. So we've used a lot of it in that approach. We talked about that a little bit. So people are going out looking at wetlands and other things. So I think I'm going to stop there. Let me just see. I just wanted to mention, again, so like our monitors are really good at picking up vernal pools. Now's the time of year to do vernal pools. I just want to mention this Birdsboro plant. I know there's only one Berks County person here, but this is a 14-mile line that's supposed to connect to a power plant. So, you know, folks, there are 40 permitted new proposed gas plants in Pennsylvania that have not been built yet. And a lot of this might be just stopping the money because they're very, very expensive. But this is a plant that Cherry's working really hard on. June 2019 is the construction date, but again, a lot of times these get pushed off, at least from our experience. But this is going to be very close to the Schuylkill River in Birdsboro. So Schuylkill River, again, is wild and scenic as well. And we've got an existing armor cast plant. That's where they're going to be building this. But you can see the Schuylkill River right up there, so it's very close to the river. And it's also very close to communities, this power plant that they want to be putting in. So she can do a whole presentation on this, but this is another one that we're recruiting people on to basically try to stop the plant, but really get some impacts on the pipelines and get out there and assess some of that area. And here's the pipeline route. It's going through Ole Valley, which has some really great protectors, and Amity Township, going up into, looks like it doesn't hit Pike Township yet, but again, this is the pipeline that has to go to that plant. And again, that would be using natural gas from the drilling areas. So that's it. I think I appreciate you for your time and everything that you do. Well, you've been a great audience. Thank you so much. I will share any kind of protocols with you, and again, we can do more trainings if somebody wants to talk to me about that, but keep up all the good and be well and stay healthy and continue wonderful goodness.